Hello and welcome to our reading of the biography, Who Were the Brothers Grimm? And this biography is a true story about Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, written by the author Avery Reed. In this book, we have done 5 other videos, and this is video number 6, and it'll be the last video. It'll be chapter 9 and 10. Before we start, we have a few vocabulary words to look over. Our first word is Prussia. Prussia is a place. It's kind of hard to explain what Prussia is, so I encourage you to look that up in a map of history, a historical map, or to Google that. Prussia is a place. Taken aback. It's 2 words. Taken aback is a term that means surprised. Scholars are people who spend all their time learning, usually working at a college or being a student for a very long time. Scholars. Publisher. A publisher is a person or company that takes words written on paper, called manuscripts, and puts the words in books. So the publisher is the person who takes a story and puts it in a book and makes a lot of copies of it so people can read it. A publisher. Thalers were a kind of money in the time and place where this story is set. So thalers were a kind of money. As far as I know, thalers don't exist in 2018 when we're reading this book, but in the 1800s in Hanover, a country that doesn't exist now either, thalers were a kind of money. Rebelled. Rebelled means to say that the ruler or king is wrong, to break rules that make a statement that the rules were unfair. So rebel means to do something that's against the law or against the rules, but when you rebel, you usually do it for a reason that you think will help things in the future. Rebelled. And university, a school you can go to after high school, can also be called a college. And we'll go over those at the end also. So now we're going to read chapters 9 and 10 from the book Who Were the Brothers Grimm? A biography about Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm by author Avery Reed. We're going to turn over here to chapter 9 and read chapters 9 and 10. After the Witzenhausen escort, Jacob returned to Kassel. So he had been escorted out of Hanover, so he went back to the town where he was from. In the fall of 1838, Wilhelm and his family joined Jacob and their younger brother Ludwig in Kassel. Remember, Kassel is where the family had lived with their parents when their parents were still alive. Jacob and Wilhelm had a difficult time finding work. Many people were now scared to hire the men who had rebelled against the king. But Jacob and Wilhelm were not discouraged. All over Germany, students and faculty, even entire towns, collected money for the 7 professors. That was the Göttingen 7 that rebelled against the king. So there's the money people are sending them. One town sent the professors 1,600 thalers. That was enough money for 2 people to live on for a year. Soon, a publisher asked Jacob and Wilhelm to create a German dictionary. The dictionary would explain how words were used from the 16th century up to the present day. The publisher wanted every possible German word listed with examples for how to use it in a sentence. Jacob and Wilhelm knew they couldn't complete the dictionary alone, so they asked more than 50 scholars to help collect words. They sent each scholar a strip strips of paper that were all the same size. That's a lot of papers and a lot of words. The brothers wanted to have an organized system to keep track of the words. Soon, the Grimms' desks were covered with thousands of little white strips of paper. At this time, the most important European scholars were all members of the Berlin Academy of Sciences. The Berlin Academy awarded money to scholars for their research projects. Wilhelm and Jacob were invited to join the academy. There's the Berlin Academy of Sciences, and you remember Berlin is a city in the country of Germany, and an academy is a place where people work together to learn things, and in this case, different kinds of sciences. They happily accepted, though it meant moving to the bustling city of Berlin. Then, in November 1840, came more good news. The new king of Prussia decided to fund Jacob and Wilhelm's work on the German dictionary. They would never have to worry about money again. A few weeks later, Jacob traveled to Berlin to look for an apartment. He couldn't believe how well known he was. So in this giant city in the country of Germany, the city of Berlin, everybody already knew who Jacob was. And they didn't have Facebook, and they didn't have TV. I don't think they had radio. They might have had radio by then, but I don't think so. And they might have had newspapers, but this is just because of books he'd written and things he'd done that people knew who Jacob was in this giant city. He couldn't believe how well known he was. Everyone wanted to have him over for dinner. Jacob was invited to so many parties and dinners that he stayed several weeks longer than planned, just so he could go to parties and dinners with all the people who knew about him and wanted to talk to him. By February 1841, the Grimms had moved to Berlin. Until this time, the brothers had lectured to only small numbers of students, but now they were members of the academy. Several hundred people came to listen to them speak. So they would stand on stage and teach and just talk, and everyone would listen. The crowd cheered loudly when Jacob and Wilhelm walked out on stage for their first lecture. Both brothers were taken aback. Jacob had to pause several times when speaking to collect his thoughts. Wilhelm was moved to tears. He had never received such praise for their work. Jacob and Wilhelm ate dinner with princes. The king invited them to see plays at the palace. So there they are meeting the king, and the king was just letting them come over to watch the entertainment. Crowds would gather outside their home and sing songs until Jacob and Wilhelm stepped out onto the balcony. The Grimms were greeted with cheers, speeches, and even gifts. Jacob and Wilhelm were honored for their work all across the world. Jacob received Prussia's highest award. Before Jacob, only soldiers had been given this honor. France awarded Jacob with the Cross of the Legion of Honor. England made the brothers members of the Philological Society, the oldest society in Great Britain dedicated to studying language. And the United States admitted Jacob into the Academy of Arts and Sciences. Like the Berlin Academy, it was a group of famous writers, scientists, and teachers. Important men from all over Europe traveled to Berlin just to meet the famous Brothers Grimm. Neither Jacob nor Wilhelm liked being interrupted from work, but they were kind to their visitors, inviting them in for tea, for a walk in the garden. One day, Hans Christian Andersen, a famous Danish author, visited the Grimms. In those days, it was polite to bring a letter of introduction when meeting someone for the first time. So they were supposed to bring a letter explaining who they were if you came. Because, like I said, you couldn't just call on the phone and ask someone, or you couldn't check their Facebook or Google them. So you'd have to bring a letter from someone else explaining who the person was. But Hans Christian Andersen did not think he needed one. Surely the Grimms had heard of him. He was a famous author of stories for children, kind of like they were. But Andersen was mistaken. Jacob had no idea who he was, and Wilhelm was not home at the time. Andersen was embarrassed to have just shown up on the doorstep of the famous Grimm brothers. Here's a little part about Hans Christian Andersen. I'll let you pause the video if you'd like to read about him. Another very famous author. Chapter 10. Happily Ever After. The Grimms continued to work on their dictionary, but made very little progress. It was such a huge job. Jacob concentrated on words beginning with the A through C, while Wilhelm worked only on the letter D. Work on the dictionary wasn't as much fun as collecting fairy tales had been years earlier. Jacob was becoming frustrated with Wilhelm. Wilhelm wasn't as precise with his work as Jacob was, and he often borrowed books from Jacob's study without returning them. Even when Wilhelm did return the books, Jacob complained that Wilhelm was making too much noise by constantly opening and shutting doors. Sounds like they're starting to argue like a lot of brothers do. There they are, opening and shutting doors, returning books, while Jacob works and works. Finally, in 1854, 16 years after starting the dictionary, Jacob and Wilhelm published the first volume, A through Birmolki. Just 2 letters worth of words. Took them 16 years. They hadn't even gotten through all the words starting with B. The brothers realized they would never finish the dictionary in their lifetimes. Here's another excerpt about the German dictionary if you'd like to pause the video and read that. It says it wasn't finished until 1960. So 100 years to make the dictionary for the German language. In 1859, Wilhelm and his family took a vacation to the Elbe River. While on the trip, Wilhelm became sick. He returned home. His health did not improve. When Wilhelm's fever grew worse, Dorothea and Jacob were worried this would be the end. Jacob stayed by his brother's bedside all night long and through the next day. At times, the fever made Wilhelm think that Jacob was not his brother, but a painting. At other times, Wilhelm was clear-headed. And there's Wilhelm sick in the bed, and Jacob sitting by him, and his wife Dorothea sitting by him. Just 2 hours before he died, Wilhelm told one of his favorite stories. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, on December 16th, 1859, Wilhelm died. His body was laid in his study. Jacob kept coming to the room to look at the brother and best friend he would never see again. For a while, all of Wilhelm's books and papers were kept just as he had left them, so that a painter could record Wilhelm's study. Would Jacob be able to go on without his beloved Wilhelm? They were famous as the Brothers Grimm, after all. Berlin newspapers reported that when Jacob was alone in the house, he spent his time looking for Wilhelm. But this was not true. Jacob continued to live and work just as he had before Wilhelm's death. Jacob finished Wilhelm's last project for him. Jacob also sent the publisher the second piece of the dictionary, which Wilhelm had finished. It went up to the letter D. Jacob then set to work on the next 2 volumes of the dictionary. In the fall, Jacob took a trip to the mountains. The fresh air and travel seemed at first to be good for him, but when he returned home, he caught a cold, which soon developed into a more serious illness. One Saturday afternoon in September, Jacob was sitting with his niece, Auguste, when he suffered a stroke. Jacob's right arm couldn't move, and he could no longer speak. The next day, Jacob's heart beat so wildly, Auguste thought it might explode. At one point, Jacob looked steadily at a photograph of Wilhelm, and then just after 10 o'clock in the evening on September 20th, 1863, Jacob died. Many people attended Jacob's funeral. Journals and newspapers published articles about his life. This illustration or drawing shows all the people that tried to come to Jacob's funeral. In later years, people would argue over which of the brothers was the greatest scholar. However, today we remember Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm most for their fairy tales. The fairy tales live on because they teach us to see the world differently. There are dragons and witches in difficult times, but there are also beautiful princesses and brave princes, daring quests, and happily ever afters. Next to the Bible, Children's Household Tales is the most widely read book in Germany. But Jacob and Wilhelm didn't just preserve these fairy tales for the German people. They did so for the world. Grimm's fairy tales have been translated into more than 160 different languages and have been illustrated by hundreds of artists. They have also been adapted into countless movies, plays, and television shows. Wilhelm Grimm once wrote, "In the fairy tales, a world of magic is opened up before us, one which still exists among us in secret forests, in underground caves, and in the deepest sea, and it is still visible to children. The work of the Brothers Grimm certainly has earned its place in the hearts and on the bookshelves of children around the world." There's Jacob and Wilhelm with one of the books of fairy tales they wrote. And then if you'd like to look at this timeline, you could pause the video. I'll move it up and let you see all the different years on the timeline of their life. And then this one is the timeline of the world. Very interesting to see them side by side. I'll try to zoom out in a second and try to let you see them side by side in case you're interested in that. We hope that you've enjoyed this reading of Who Were the Brothers Grimm? I know that I've learned a lot by reading this biography, this true story with facts about the lives of Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm that I didn't know before. And the author Avery Reed did a great job of presenting the facts of Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm's life. And the illustrator of this book, John O'Brien, did a great job of giving us some drawings or some illustrations to help us understand the book. Really quickly, we'll go through these last vocabulary words with you. And you can pause the video if you would like to look at the definitions more. University, rebelled, tellers, publisher, scholars, taken aback, and Prussia. Again, thanks for reading Who Were the Brothers Grimm with us, and we hope you enjoyed this biography.